Talk of homegrown terrorism in Canada tends to focus on foreign influences such as ISIS, but that misses other all too common kinds of extremist violence. For example, the killing of police officers in Moncton, New Brunswick in 2014 and in Edmonton, Alberta in 2015. Joining us now to explain the other terror threat, here's Barbara Perry. She's a professor of criminology at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, and we are happy to welcome you here and grateful you made the long drive from Oshawa to get here.
Not so long, I took the train.
Oh, even better.
But thank you, an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Not at all. Let's just put up these graphics before we get started here on our conversation. This, according to internal CSIS documents obtained from the Toronto Star, lone actor attacks more often come from right-wing extremist ideologies than from jihadist extremism, and data compiled by the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security and Society shows that in the last 15 years, 59% of lone actor attacks were ideologically motivated by right-wing extremist ideology. Let's just do it. I think off the top that's going to come as a surprise to a lot of people who, when they hear terror, automatically equate it with, you know, Islamic extremism and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's become the discourse. That's become the emphasis for us and the priority.
So we need to rethink our notion of what terrorism is these days. Is that the point?
Well, I think be more expansive in our definition, our understanding of what terrorism is, what extremism is in the Canadian context and worldwide as well. It's not just in our country where we see that disproportionate attention. You've clearly seen the headlines out of Europe where right-wing parties are very powerful, as well as more informal groups on the street. So yeah.
So my hunch is people, when you say Islamofascism or Islamic extremist terrorism, people know what you mean. Mm-hmm. When we talk about right-wing extremist terrorism, maybe less so. So do you want to tell us what it is?
Oh, absolutely, sure. For me, and the definitions are legion, and so no real consensus there, but I really see two main streams, and one is an emphasis on nationalism as defined through racial and ethnic and gender lenses as well. Also tied in very often with a anti-statist or anti-authoritarian perception as well. In particular, in the current context, the state is held responsible for the undeserved rights gained by minority groups, women, LGBTQ communities, that sort of thing. So that's really the core. And then offshoots of that, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitism, obviously, a whole array of isms that follow from that as well.
Is it a coordinated, international, organized effort in the way that many people see Islamic extremism being?
It is international. It's very much a global phenomenon, and it has been, for generations, really. Because the homeland really is Europe and Western Europe in particular, and so there's this hearkening back to that purity of the white race that derived from Europe, and so you see a lot of connection between North American and European extremists, but even more so now with the access to online venues, whether it's Facebook or websites or just email exchanges that sort of help them to coalesce around these ideologies.
And why would we call it right-wing extremism?
I think the right really refers to that traditional left-right ideological spectrum, liberalism, conservatism. So there really is an emphasis amongst these actors on reclaiming traditional conservative values around patriarchy, around white privilege, those sorts of pieces.
Let me follow up on that, because again, we're going to make these comparisons to Islamic extremism as we go along here. And, for many people, that's pretty clear. They want to terrorize, they want to establish a caliphate, they want to bring Sharia law, right? I mean, the agenda is pretty upfront. What's the agenda for a right-wing extremist?
It's more reactionary in the sense that it's an attempt from their perspective to right the balance or correct the balance that has swung too far. Which way am I going? Too far to the left in terms of recognizing the rights of what have traditionally been marginalized communities, and immigration policy, multiculturalism, all of those pieces are a part of it, to the detriment of white privilege from their perspective.
And what kind of terrorist act is the sort of coin of the realm for this part?
The terrorist acts in particular they're very, very different than what we understand, what we think of as, the more common, or I shouldn't say more common, the more representative forms of jihadi-related extremism, which we understand to be, bombs and mass destruction, that sort of thing, which isn't the case. But in these cases, there's a lot of one-on-one violence, but also sort of campaigns of violence, if you will, sometimes directed towards particular individuals from racialized communities, for example, or families. And sometimes, as we've seen even just in the last 5 or 6 years, campaigns targeted towards racialized and minority communities in a particular city or in a particular region, on a daily basis and going for weeks, but sometimes months.
So a guy who says, I'm going to take the biggest gun I can and go into a church in Charleston, South Carolina and kill some people, that's an example.
Yeah, that's clearly an example.
On the other hand, the bomb, this is back when Bill Clinton was president, the bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, which killed, 160, 170 people, something like that. I mean, that's part of it too, obviously, is it not?
Yeah.
So they do bomb buildings.
Yeah, we haven't had cases like that. I should back off. We haven't had sort of that dramatic a case in the Canadian context, but we have had, plenty of fire bombs and arson attacks on mosques and synagogues, for example. Not so much directed towards state agencies as towards particular communities.
You've mapped this out, I think. Sheldon, you want to bring this up? Let's. Here's the data on the distribution of right-wing extremist groups across the country. Take us through this map, if you like, east to west, if you want, and sort of give us a sense about where it's all located.
And I'm going to say at the outset that part of this data, I think, really reflects the attention that's paid, the differential attention that's paid to right-wing activity and hate crime generally across the country. That there are some areas that are, law enforcement, for example, is much more cognizant of the issue. But also, I think the second thing to say is that there's a lot of movement back and forth amongst these regions. So we really do see that concentration in Quebec, and in particular, skinhead movement in Quebec, which surprised me. I thought skinhead movement was dead, but alive and well in Quebec. But then Western Ontario, Alberta, both in Edmonton and Calgary, and some of the outlying regions, and then the Lower Mainland in British Columbia are really the hotbeds. But there's a lot of movement back and forth. When it gets too hot from a law enforcement perspective, for example, in one area, then they might move on to, come back to Ontario and then, back to BC, that sort of thing. So there is a lot of movement. But two, just in terms of the sizes of the groups, they vary dramatically. One law enforcement officer referred to some as three-man wrecking crews. It really is only a couple of guys, typically guys, who have set themselves the task of cleansing their own little community, whatever that might be. But some of the skinhead groups in particular are, much larger than that in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Earlier in the 90s, some of them were, closer to 100. But that we sort of backed away from those large groups.
As I look at Atlantic Canada, Sheldon, I don't know if you want to bring that map back up, but if you look at Atlantic Canada, you've got very little there, despite the fact that it is a much less diverse population than, say, here in Ontario. Any theories as to why that would be?
Well, I think, as you said, it is not a very diverse community. So whatever, even just talking in terms of hate crime, whatever violence might occur there is typically directed towards the Aboriginal community. So the movement hasn't really grown, or at least we've not had reports, and sort of our informants weren't able to identify much in that respect. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. I think especially, areas bordering Quebec, there's a little bit of spillover in that area.
Okay, let's do, Sheldon, graphic at the bottom, the board number 1. A spokesperson for CSIS had this to say about all of this. Right-wing extremist circles appear to be fragmented and primarily pose a threat to public order and not to national security. Tell me about that distinction. Not to public order, or excuse me, a threat to public order, but not to national security. What's the difference?
Yeah, and that's something I hear quite often when I'm interviewing law enforcement and intelligence is, why are we not paying attention to this? And that's a very common refrain. And so, yeah, there is a tendency to describe the acts of right-wing extremists as simply criminal events, threats to public order as a reflection of individual pathology rather than cultural pathology, as we tend to do with Islamic inspired violence. And so I think the problem with that is that it doesn't recognize that threats to disparate communities across the country on a regular basis are also threats to our national sense of well-being in terms of being direct threats to our constitutional values. And how is that not extremist? Even in the case of Justin Bork, who shot, as we know, in Moncton, 3 RCMP officers, that was not characterized as terrorism. There was one headline. I absolutely would. Yeah, using those same definitions. There was even a headline that said, yes, he terrorized a community, but he was not a terrorist. But he was motivated by, ideological, some of those same threads that I talked about earlier on. Anti-statism, pro-gun rights, which is unusual in the Canadian context, but that was him. And, some of these more traditional right-wing ideologies.
Back when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, there were 3 people arrested into an alleged plot to open fire at a mall in Halifax. And the Justice Minister at the time, who was Peter MacKay, called these alleged perpetrators murderous misfits. He says the attack does not appear to have been culturally motivated, therefore not linked to terrorism. What do you think about that characterization?
Yeah, I think it was an inapt characterization. It was quite clear, I think, after the fact that these youth were inspired by right-wing and white supremacist ideologies. They had some of the literature, the propaganda was on their websites and their website history. And so, yeah, clearly they were ideologically motivated. Again, sort of saw a mission to make a statement about the changing demographics and the changing policies in their part of the world, but also across Canada as well.
So that reflects a bit of a mindset that if it's not related to Islam, it's not terrorism,
right?
Which you think we need to change.
Yeah.
Do we not take right-wing extremism seriously enough in this country?
I don't think we do, and I think we don't really recognize the extent of the threat. So for the report that I've shared with you, from 1980 to about mid-2015, we identified over 120 incidents associated with right-wing extremist individuals and groups. And 28 just in the last, since 2010, which is far more than the number of incidents associated with Islamic extremism. Yet, again, we're not counting that. Yeah.
If the idea at the end of the day is to terrorize, does it make a difference whether it's rooted in Islam or rooted in right-wing extremism?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the definition that I use for hate crime, which is what my work generally revolves around, is an act intended to intimidate individuals and communities, which is very much the same as sort of our federal definition of terrorism. They're very much parallel. Okay,
in which case, though, are there differences between those two phenomena as well?
There are differences in the way I think that we understand it and count it. If it's not, so I ran across a great statement yesterday that compared the two in terms of calling one local and lesser and one global and greater, which is still, that's the perception. That's not how this person characterized it, but that's the perception. And again, if you want to unpack that, as I mentioned earlier on, the right-wing extremist movement is also global and has the capacity for greater levels of violence. You mentioned the Al-Fadar Mura attack. That's clearly, that's clearly an example of that. So I think that there is the potential in both within both groups for the same level and kind of violence. Now, fortunately, in Canada, we haven't seen, in fact, in either. With respect to either end of that spectrum, if you like, we haven't seen those really dramatic, mass casualties.
The federal government has announced the creation of this new position called a de-radicalization officer. Countering violent extremism, CVE programs, they're being developed.
Yeah.
Do you think countering right-wing violent extremism will fall under this rubric? Because I'm not sure that's what they've intended, right?
No, it could very well, and it should. I think that we need to follow the example that we've seen in the UK with their PREVENT program, which was a very similar sort of strategy, which was heavily criticized for, having virtually nothing to say about right-wing extremism. So I think it's important very early on to broaden that conversation and to include those of us who are paying attention. And it's not just academics. There are law enforcement agencies agencies and intelligence agencies across the country who are paying attention. So it's important to have them as part of the conversation as well, and to draw on that.
And let's remember why, because there are more right-wing extremism acts of terrorism than Islamic-related acts of terrorism.
Yes, historically
The
that has been the
numbers
case.
show that to be the case.
Just in the last decade even.
Okay, again, in which case, if you're talking about putting into place some kind of de-radicalization process, would the nuts and bolts of that kind of a program be the same if you were a right-wing extremist versus motivated by jihad?
Yeah, because many of the reasons that people are vulnerable to radicalization are very similar, it makes sense in many respects to engage in similar activities, especially using formers as main actors, key actors in those initiatives. But the difficulty, I think, with right-wing extremism is that it will send sort of conflicting messages, because in the broader culture we see these same messages: anti-immigration stance, Islamophobia, whether it's in the media, whether it's in political rhetoric. So that is part and parcel of our fabric, and yet we want to engage in counterterrorism that denies those same ideologies and counters those same ideologies. So I think we have to do a lot of work at the broader cultural level as well as at the level of extremists.
Professor Perry, we thank you for taking the train in from Oshawa to give us a new way of thinking about this subject. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for taking it
Barbara
on.
Perry, Professor, Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.